They said no man had ever crossed Red Canyon after sunset and come back with the same story, because somewhere in that stretch of red stone and drifting dust there walked a warrior no one could defeat, a silent figure in a dark mask who appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly, leaving only rumors behind. 17 gunmen had tried to pass that canyon in the last 3 months. 17 had turned around before reaching the far ridge, and none of them could describe the warrior the same way. Some said the fighter moved like smoke between the rocks. Others swore the stranger rode a black horse that never made a sound on gravel. A few insisted the warrior carried no gun at all, only a long blade that caught the sun like silver lightning. But they all agreed on one thing. No one had seen the face beneath the helmet. The story spread across trading posts and saloons from Silver Creek to Dry Mesa until men began calling the stranger a ghost, the Phantom of Red Canyon. Most cowboys laughed when they first heard the tale. Frontier men always did. The West was full of stories that grew bigger with every mile of dust. But the laughter faded when wagon trains began choosing routes 20 miles longer just to avoid that canyon. Because rumors were one thing, empty supply wagons were another. Ethan Calloway heard the story the same way most men did, leaning against the porch of a weathered trading post with the smell of horse leather and hot wind hanging in the air. He listened quietly while a ranch hand described the masked warrior with wide eyes and nervous hands, and when the man finished, Ethan simply looked toward the red cliffs on the horizon. Red Canyon stood there like a long scar across the desert, 10 miles of narrow trail winding between towering walls of sandstone that turned deep crimson every evening when the sun dropped low. The canyon was the fastest road between Silver Creek and the outer settlements. It saved almost 12 miles of hard riding. 12 miles mattered when you were hauling medicine across the frontier. The ranch hand finished his story and shook his head. "I'm telling you," he said, "that warrior stops everyone." Ethan studied the canyon a long moment before answering. His voice was calm, almost thoughtful. "Everyone." The ranch hand nodded. "Everyone." A faint smile touched Ethan Calloway's face, the kind of quiet smile that didn't carry much humor. Because men who had known Ethan long enough understood something about him. He was the kind of cowboy who only rode toward problems other men avoided. And somewhere deep inside Red Canyon, beneath the red stone and the cooling desert wind, a masked Apache warrior was already waiting. The wind across the desert carried heat even in late afternoon, rolling down from the red cliffs in slow waves that made the distant canyon shimmer like it was alive. Ethan Calloway saddled his horse without hurry, the leather creaking softly beneath his hands while the sun drifted lower in the sky. Most men in Silver Creek had already turned their horses towards safer trails, choosing the longer road that wound around the canyon and added nearly half a day to the journey. But Ethan had never been the kind of man who measured his choices by comfort. The supply wagon waited near the edge of town, its wooden sides packed with medicine bound for a mining settlement nearly 30 miles west. Fever had spread through that camp for weeks, and the doctor in Silver Creek had said plainly that the medicine needed to reach them before the next sunrise. Without the canyon road, the wagon would arrive too late. A young ranch hand stood beside the team of horses, glancing nervously toward the red cliffs. "You really plan on riding through there?" he asked. Ethan tightened the saddle strap and rested one hand on the horn of the saddle, his eyes following the narrow trail that disappeared between the towering canyon walls nearly 10 miles away. The place looked quiet from this distance. Too quiet. The kind of silence that made men uneasy without knowing why. "That is the fastest road," Ethan answered calmly. The ranch hand shook his head slowly. "Fastest road does not mean safest road." Ethan mounted his horse and adjusted the brim of his hat, letting his gaze sweep once more across the open desert. Out here the land stretched mile after mile of pale sand and dry grass, broken only by the tall red stone that formed the canyon walls. In the fading sunlight, those cliffs looked darker, almost like a line of watchful sentinels guarding the trail beyond. The young ranch hand lowered his voice. "They say the warrior shows up before sunset." Ethan looked back at him. "They say a lot of things." For a moment neither man spoke. A hawk circled high above the desert, its shadow drifting slowly across the ground. Then Ethan turned his horse toward the canyon and nudged the reins forward. The ride took nearly an hour across open desert. The air grew cooler as the sun slid closer to the horizon, and the red cliffs rose higher with every mile until they stood hundreds of feet tall on both sides of the narrow entrance to the canyon trail. Ethan slowed his horse when he reached the shadow of the cliffs. The world felt different here. The wind was softer. The sounds of the desert faded into a quiet stillness that made every hoof step echo faintly against the stone. The canyon stretched ahead in a winding path barely wide enough for a wagon to pass, twisting deeper between the towering red walls. Ethan studied the trail for a long moment before guiding his horse forward into the shade. The temperature dropped almost 10 degrees as soon as he crossed the threshold of the canyon. Sand shifted under the horse's hooves while the last sunlight painted the stone walls in deep shades of crimson and gold. Ethan had ridden only a quarter mile into the canyon when the horse suddenly slowed on its own, ears turning sharply toward the rocks above the trail. Ethan followed the horse's gaze upward. At first he saw nothing, only silent stone and the fading glow of sunset against the canyon walls. Then a shape moved along the ridge above the trail, barely visible against the red sky. A rider, still as the stone itself, watching. The rider on the ridge did not move for several seconds, and in that silence the canyon seemed to grow narrower around Ethan Calloway, as if the stone itself was listening. The sun had nearly slipped behind the western cliffs, leaving only a ribbon of amber light along the canyon rim. In that fading glow the figure above looked almost unreal, a dark silhouette against the sky. Ethan rested one hand loosely on the saddle horn and studied the stranger without speaking. The horse beneath him shifted its weight and let out a slow breath, the sound echoing softly between the red walls. The rider above finally began to move. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a slow, deliberate motion as the horse stepped along the ridge and then descended toward the trail through a narrow break in the rocks that Ethan had not noticed before. Gravel rolled quietly beneath the hooves as the rider approached the canyon floor. The distance between them closed until the stranger stopped about 20 yards away. Up close the details became clearer. The horse was dark brown and carried itself with the calm balance of an animal trained for long rides across rough ground. The rider wore a dark coat that blended with the shadows of the canyon, and over the head rested a smooth metal helmet shaped to cover the entire face. No eyes visible. No expression, just a narrow slit across the front where the fading light reflected faintly like a strip of silver. The helmet looked older than the rest of the clothing, as if it had passed through many seasons of desert wind. The stranger held no gun. Instead, one hand rested near the saddle where a long blade hung in a leather sheath. For a moment, neither rider spoke. The canyon wind slipped through the rocks with a low whisper that carried the dry scent of sand and sage. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment stretching out between them. This was the figure from the stories, the one who had turned back every traveler who tried to pass. Yet the presence before him did not feel like the threat the rumors had described. The rider simply watched him, waiting. Finally, the stranger spoke. The voice that came from behind the helmet was steady and calm. Not loud, not angry, just certain. Turn back. The words drifted through the canyon like a quiet warning carried by the wind. Ethan tilted his head slightly beneath the brim of his hat. I cannot do that. The rider remained still for a moment, as if measuring the meaning of those words. Then the voice came again. No one crosses this canyon today. Ethan glanced briefly toward the deeper trail winding between the towering red walls behind the masked figure. The mining settlement was still many miles beyond that narrow passage. Every mile mattered. He looked back at the stranger. There is medicine in the wagon behind me, he said. People are waiting for it. The rider shifted slightly in the saddle, the helmet turning just enough for the fading sunlight to catch its edge. For a brief second the metal flashed bright against the dark stone. There are reasons this road must remain closed, the stranger answered quietly. Ethan studied the rider again. The calm posture, the careful choice of words. Nothing about the figure suggested cruelty or anger, only determination. Ethan rested both hands on the saddle horn and sighed softly. Then it seems we both rode here for something important. The canyon fell silent again, and slowly, the masked rider reached for the blade. The metal blade slid from its leather sheath with a quiet sound that seemed louder than it should have in the narrow canyon. The masked rider did not raise the weapon in anger or rush forward with reckless speed. Instead, the figure simply held the blade low beside the saddle, as if presenting a fact that could no longer be avoided. Ethan Calloway watched carefully from his own horse. The gesture told him something important. This was not a bandit looking for trouble, and not a desperate fighter trying to prove strength. The rider moved with patience and control, like someone who had repeated the same moment many times before. Ethan slowly swung one leg over the saddle and stepped down into the cool sand of the canyon floor. The air had grown noticeably colder since the sun slipped behind the cliffs. The last light above the canyon rim turned the red stone walls into dark copper towers stretching hundreds of feet into the sky. His boots pressed softly into the sand as he walked a few steps forward. The masked rider mirrored the movement and dismounted as well. Now both of them stood on the narrow trail, about 15 yards apart, two quiet figures framed by the deepening shadows of the canyon. Ethan noticed again that the stranger carried no firearm. Only the long blade rested calmly in one hand. That detail alone separated this encounter from the kind of confrontations that usually unfolded across the frontier. Most men reach for guns first. This warrior had chosen a different language. Ethan removed his hat and brushed a small layer of dust from the brim before placing it back on his head. "I would prefer we talk," he said evenly. The helmet turned slightly toward him, the narrow slit reflecting the last strip of light above the canyon. "Talking has already happened," the rider replied quietly. "You were warned." Ethan glanced toward the deeper trail winding through the canyon and then back again. "I was told to turn back," he said. "That is not the same as understanding why." For a moment the masked figure did not respond. The wind shifted along the canyon floor carrying the faint smell of sagebrush and dry stone. Somewhere far above a hawk cried once before the sound faded into the evening air. The warrior adjusted the grip on the blade, but did not advance. "This canyon is closed," the voice said again. Ethan folded his arms slowly across his chest and studied the figure more carefully now. The height of the rider, the balance in the stance, the way the boots settled lightly in the sand without wasting motion. Whoever stood behind that helmet was trained, disciplined, and very sure of the ground beneath their feet. Ethan had seen that kind of movement before during his years riding as a scout across the frontier. It was the posture of someone protecting something, not someone seeking trouble. Ethan spoke again, his tone calm but firm. "People beyond these cliffs are waiting for medicine." The helmet tilted just slightly. "People beyond these cliffs are also waiting for peace," the rider answered. The words hung in the cooling air like a quiet riddle. Ethan looked once more at the narrow trail disappearing deeper between the towering canyon walls. Then he turned back to the masked figure. "Seems to me we both have reasons that matter." The warrior stood still for several seconds before raising the blade slowly into the fading light. Not threatening, simply ready. And in that silent canyon, Ethan Calloway understood something important. This road would not open with words alone. The masked warrior stepped forward first, the long blade held steady in the fading canyon light, and Ethan Calloway understood that the moment had shifted from words to something quieter and more honest. He reached down slowly and unfastened the leather strap that held his own blade against the saddle. The sound of the buckle sliding loose echoed softly against the red stone walls. Ethan drew the blade with calm care, letting the metal catch the last sliver of sunlight above the canyon rim. Neither of them rushed. Neither of them raised their voices. The desert had a way of stripping things down to what mattered, and in that narrow stretch of sand between the towering cliffs there was no audience, no crowd, only two travelers standing between two different duties. Ethan stepped forward until only 10 yards separated them. The masked warrior moved with the same measured patience, boots pressing lightly into the soft sand. The canyon wind drifted between them, carrying the scent of warm rock cooling in the evening air. For a moment, they simply circled each other, not with hostility, but with careful observation. Ethan noticed the balance in the warrior's stance again. The shoulders were relaxed, the blade held low and precise, never trembling, never wasted. Whoever stood behind that helmet had trained for years to move exactly like this. Ethan shifted his footing slightly and lifted the blade into a ready position. The warrior answered with the same motion, metal glinting faintly in the deepening shadows. Their first exchange happened so quickly that the sound echoed sharply across the canyon. Steel touched steel once, then separated again as both stepped back almost at the same moment. It was not a clash meant to injure or overpower. It felt more like a question asked in the language of skill. Ethan felt a quiet surprise settle in his chest. The warrior was fast. Faster than most riders he had met in years of traveling across the frontier. The masked figure moved again, stepping lightly across the sand with a precision that suggested complete awareness of every inch of ground. Ethan matched the movement instinctively. Another brief meeting of blades rang against the canyon walls, followed by a pause as both stepped back again. The silence afterward felt heavier than the sound itself. Ethan could see now that the warrior's strikes avoided his shoulders, avoided his chest, avoiding any place that might cause real harm. The intention was clear. This was not a fight meant to destroy. It was a test meant to stop him. Ethan lowered his blade slightly and studied the helmet once more. The narrow slit revealed nothing but darkness behind the metal. "You could have ended this quickly," he said quietly. The warrior did not answer right away. Instead, the figure adjusted their stance again, the blade lifting just a little higher into the evening light. When the voice finally came from behind the helmet, it carried the same calm certainty as before. "I am not here to end anything." The words lingered in the canyon air while the sun disappeared completely beyond the cliffs, leaving only cool shadows stretching across the sand. Ethan felt something unexpected settle in his thoughts. This was not simply a guardian of a road. This was someone protecting something deeper than a trail through the desert. The warrior stepped forward once more, the blade rising with quiet precision. And Ethan realized that the test was not finished yet. The canyon had grown darker now that the sun had disappeared behind the red cliffs, leaving only a faint ribbon of pale evening sky above the narrow walls. The air felt cooler, and every sound seemed sharper in the quiet. Ethan Calloway shifted his stance in the sand while the masked warrior stood a few yards away, blade raised with steady patience. Neither of them rushed. The moment had turned into something slower, almost thoughtful, like two travelers trying to read the same map from opposite sides. Ethan stepped forward again, lifting his blade carefully. The warrior responded instantly, their movements light and controlled. Steel met steel once more with a clear ringing sound that echoed through the canyon before fading into the open desert beyond. The contact lasted only a second before both stepped apart again. Ethan noticed it once more. The warrior always redirected the motion away from harm, guiding the blade aside instead of driving it forward. It was deliberate, almost protective. The masked figure moved again with remarkable balance, boots sliding across the sand with the kind of grace that only came from years of training. Ethan adjusted his grip and followed the motion, letting instinct guide him as the two circled beneath the rising evening shadows. The canyon wind shifted again, stirring dust along the ground and brushing against the metal helmet. Another quick exchange of blades followed, and this time the sound rang louder against the stone. Ethan stepped back to regain balance and raised his weapon once more, studying the warrior closely. Something about the movement felt familiar now. The speed, the precision, even the rhythm of the breathing behind the helmet. The warrior stepped forward again and lifted the blade in a smooth arc meant to redirect Ethan's next motion. Ethan answered the movement, and the two blades crossed briefly in the center of the trail. For a moment the metal locked together, neither side pushing harder than the other. Ethan leaned slightly to shift the balance and felt the warrior adjust in response. In that small moment of movement, something unexpected happened. The edge of Ethan's blade brushed against the side of the helmet, not with force, but just enough to break the balance of the moment. The metal piece slipped loose from its place. For one quiet second it hung there between them. Then the helmet slid free and fell into the sand with a soft, hollow sound. The canyon seemed to hold its breath. Long dark hair spilled forward into the evening air, catching the faint light from the sky above the cliffs. Ethan lowered his blade slowly, his expression changing in silent surprise. The warrior standing across from him was not the man he had expected. The face revealed beneath the fallen helmet was young and calm, with sharp eyes that reflected the last trace of twilight. An Apache woman stood before him, steady and unafraid. She did not reach for the helmet on the ground. She simply met his gaze across the quiet canyon. For a moment neither of them spoke. The wind moved gently through the rocks above, carrying the distant cry of a night bird across the darkening sky. Finally she spoke, her voice clear and calm in the still air. "Now you see why the road must remain closed." Ethan looked at the fallen helmet, then back at the woman who had faced him without hesitation. And suddenly the canyon felt far deeper than it had only minutes before. The helmet lay in the sand between them, half buried where it had fallen, its metal surface already losing the last trace of warmth from the vanished sunlight. Ethan Calloway lowered his blade slowly, not out of weakness, but out of understanding. The moment had changed. The figure standing across from him was no longer a nameless guardian hidden behind steel. Long dark hair moved gently in the evening breeze, and the woman's eyes remained steady as the deep blue of twilight began to settle over the canyon. Neither of them moved for several seconds. The wind whispered along the stone walls hundreds of feet above, carrying with it the quiet sounds of the desert preparing for night. Ethan studied her carefully now. The calm in her posture had not changed. Since the helmet fell, her blade remained raised, but the tension in the moment had softened into something more measured, something almost respectful. "You are Apache," Ethan said quietly. The woman gave a small nod. "My name is Ayanna Red Hawk." Her voice was steady, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had spoken the truth many times before. Ethan let the name settle in the air between them. It sounded older than the canyon itself. He lowered the tip of his blade toward the sand, but did not yet return it to the sheath. "You could have told me before we crossed blades." Ayanna glanced briefly at the helmet resting in the dust. "Many men hear words, but do not listen to them," she replied. "They listen only after they see." The canyon darkened further as the last color left the sky above the cliffs. A cool wind drifted through the narrow passage, stirring small lines of sand across the trail. Ethan followed her gaze for a moment before looking deeper into the canyon behind her. The narrow road curved between towering red walls, disappearing into darkness several miles ahead. "You said the road must remain closed," he said. "Now I would like to understand why." Ayanna studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether the answer belonged to him at all. Finally she lowered her blade slightly, though she did not sheath it. "This canyon is not only a road," she said. "Beneath these cliffs lies the resting ground of my people." Ethan remained silent as she continued. "Long before wagons and rail lines and trading posts crossed this land, the Red Hawk tribe buried our ancestors beneath these stones. This canyon carries their memory, their spirits." Her voice softened but did not lose its strength. "Many seasons ago soldiers came searching for silver in these hills. They believed this canyon hid something valuable beneath the ground. When they learned the truth, they left for a time. But rumors travel faster than horses." Ethan slowly began to understand. "If more men come searching," he said quietly, "they will tear this canyon apart looking for what they believe is hidden here." Ayanna nodded once. "Yes." The wind shifted again, carrying a distant sound of wagon wheels somewhere far beyond the canyon entrance. The medicine wagon. Ethan glanced back toward the darkening trail behind him and then returned. His gaze to Ayanna. "The wagon behind me carries medicine," he said. "People are waiting for it tonight." Ayanna met his eyes without anger, only with quiet certainty. "And the men who follow wagons are often not healers," she replied. "If the road opens once, it will never close again." Ethan looked down at the fallen helmet resting between them. Then he looked at the silent canyon stretching miles into the night. And he realized the road before him was no longer a simple trail through stone. The canyon grew quieter as night settled over the red stone walls, and the faint glow of the rising moon began to replace the last memory of sunlight. Ethan Calloway stood still for a long moment after Ayanna finished speaking, letting the weight of her words settle into the cool desert air. Somewhere far behind him, the medicine wagon creaked softly as the horses shifted their weight, unaware that the road ahead had become more complicated than miles or distance. Ethan looked down at the sand between them where the fallen helmet still rested. Ayanna had not picked it up. The choice felt deliberate. The mask was no longer necessary. He slowly lowered his blade and slid it back into its sheath. The sound of metal returning to leather echoed gently through the canyon. Ayanna watched him carefully but did not raise her weapon again. The wind moved along the narrow passage, carrying the faint scent of sage and distant pine from the hills beyond the cliffs. Ethan lifted his eyes toward the dark trail stretching deeper through the canyon. "How far does this burial ground run?" he asked quietly. Ayanna followed his gaze into the darkness. Nearly 5 miles, she answered. Beyond the far bend, the canyon opens toward the valley. Ethan nodded slowly. He had ridden those outer hills years ago while scouting routes for wagon trails. The land beyond the canyon widened into rough ridges and narrow gullies that few travelers used because the ground was uneven and the distance longer. Most wagons avoided that terrain because it added nearly 12 miles to the journey. But Ethan also remembered something else about those hills. A narrow ridge path that curved around the north side of the canyon before descending into the valley beyond. The route was steep and rocky, but it was possible. Ethan looked back at Ayanna. There is another road, he said after a moment. She studied his face carefully. Not a road, he continued. More like a trail along the northern ridge. Wagons avoid it because the ground is rough and the climb is steep. Ayanna remained silent, waiting. Ethan glanced toward the wagon again as the horses snorted softly in the cooling night air. It would add about 12 miles, he said. Maybe a little more if the ground slows the team. The Apache woman lowered her blade slowly until the tip rested lightly against the sand. The people waiting for your medicine, she said quietly, would still receive it. Ethan calculated the distance in his mind. The climb would be slow, but the moon was already rising and the sky above the desert was clear. They would receive it before morning, he answered. Ayanna looked toward the towering canyon walls above them, where the pale moonlight now touched the highest edges of red stone. The silence stretched for several seconds before she turned back to Ethan. And the wagons that follow yours? She asked. Ethan gave a faint smile that carried the quiet confidence of a man who had traveled the frontier long enough to understand its rumors. If they ask about the canyon road, he said, I will tell them it is closed. The wind moved again through the canyon, softer now beneath the rising moon. Ayanna bent down and lifted the fallen helmet from the sand, brushing away the dust with a calm motion before holding it at her side, instead of placing it back on her head. She looked once more toward the deeper canyon, then back to Ethan Calloway. And for the first time since their blades had crossed beneath the evening sky, there was something in her expression that looked almost like quiet relief. The moon had climbed higher above the canyon by the time Ethan Calloway returned to his horse, casting pale silver light across the red stone walls that now looked almost purple in the quiet desert night. The medicine wagon waited behind him, the team of horses shifting gently in the cool air while the driver watched from the seat with patient curiosity. Ethan rested one hand on the saddle and looked back toward the narrow trail that disappeared between the towering cliffs. Ayanna Red Hawk stood there still, the fallen helmet now held calmly at her side, her dark hair moving softly in the night wind. For a moment neither of them spoke. The canyon had returned to the stillness it had known long before wagons and riders ever crossed this land. Ethan finally swung into the saddle and gathered the reins. His horse turned slowly toward the open desert behind them, where the northern ridge rose like a dark wave against the moonlit sky. The longer road waited there. Rough ground, 12 extra miles, but a clear path forward all the same. Before he nudged the horse forward, he looked back one more time. Ayanna had stepped closer to the center of the canyon trail now, the pale moonlight outlining her figure against the ancient stone walls. She placed the helmet back over her head, but did not lower the visor. The face beneath it remained visible for one last moment in the quiet light. You will reach them before morning, she said calmly. Ethan gave a small nod. And the canyon? He asked. Ayanna turned her gaze upward toward the towering cliffs that sheltered the resting ground of her people. The canyon will remain as it was meant to be, she replied. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer before guiding the horse away from the canyon entrance. The wagon driver straightened on the bench seat as Ethan approached. Road closed? The man asked. Ethan glanced once more toward the shadowed trail between the cliffs. Closed, he answered simply. The wagon wheels began to turn, creaking softly as the team followed Ethan across the moonlit desert toward the northern ridge. The climb was slow and the ground uneven, but the path curved steadily around the canyon walls, just as Ethan remembered. Hours passed beneath a sky bright with stars while the wagon climbed the rocky trail and then descended into the valley beyond. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, the distant roofs of the mining settlement appeared ahead. Smoke drifted from chimneys and lanterns still burned along the narrow streets where people had waited through the long night. The medicine arrived before sunrise, just as Ethan had promised. Weeks later, travelers passing through Silver Creek began repeating a familiar rumor again. They said a masked guardian still watched over Red Canyon, standing quietly where the road disappeared between the cliffs. Some riders claimed they had seen the figure high on the ridge at sunset, silent and patient against the red sky. Most people chose the longer road after hearing the story. And deep within the canyon, beneath the ancient stone and the endless desert wind, the resting place of the Red Hawk tribe remained undisturbed.